Alfred Russel Wallace was actually one of the most famous of all Victorian scientists. In fact, it's probably correct to say that he's one of the most famous scientists of all time, because he, together with Charles Darwin, were the first proposers of the great theory of evolution by natural selection, which someone has described as possibly the greatest idea to ever occur to a human mind.
The theory of natural selection is really important in studying evolution because it explains how evolution happens. It helps us predict where evolution might go, and it gives us a rubric for understanding the process itself. Plenty of people before Darwin and Wallace talked about evolution and described what happened, but explaining it is the key. And that's why the natural selection element of evolutionary thinking is so important. So in the early 19th century, evolution was thought about as basically development. Species develop like people or organisms do. So there's birth, there's growth, there's adulthood, and then there's ultimately death. And so the thinking about evolution matches the sort of developmental biology of organisms. Now that is a fairly straightforward idea. You've got one species developing into another, developing into another, developing into another. And the idea is you don't really need to explain it. Development just happens. When people think about evolution before Darwin and Wallace, some big names come to mind. And one is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who's a French zoologist. And Lamarck's idea is about progressive development of organisms. And imagine an escalator or moving stairs, and that's basically Lamarck's idea, that species begin at the bottom of the moving stairs, and then over their long evolutionary history they progress up the stairs and they transform from one to another to another. That transformation is regular and law-like. It's also progressive. It heads in a particular direction. And Lamarck is hugely responsible for encouraging that notion of progressive change, or what we now call evolution.
When Wallace was 5 years old, he and his family moved to the town of Hertford, just north of London. It was there that he received his only formal education at Hales Grammar School. The family finances got worse and worse until finally they couldn't afford the small amount of money that Wallace's school fees cost, so they were forced to withdraw Wallace from school, aged only 14. Became an apprentice to his older brother William, who was a land surveyor. William's work involved travelling around Britain and doing surveys for new railway lines, etc., which were going in at the time. In the early 1840s, the brothers were based at the town of Neath in Wales, and it was there that Wallace first developed his interest in natural history. Then in 1843, surveying work became scarce, and William was forced to let his brother go and find another job. Wallace eventually found work in Leicester. Leicester was actually a real key part of his life story, because it was there that he met amateur naturalist Henry Walter Bates, who he struck up a friendship with. He moved back to Wales, still corresponding with Bates, and it was whilst he was in Neath in Wales that he came upon a book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Wallace was fascinated by this idea of evolution and became an early convert. And a few years later, he suggested to Henry Walter Bates, who he was still friends with, that they go off on a collecting expedition. Bates thought this was a brilliant idea. In 1848, they set off for the Amazon, paid for a passage on a ship over to Brazil, and went off. Early on in the trip, they collected together, but then apparently they quarrelled and split up. Wallace was to go up the mighty Rio Negro, which, although it looks like a small tributary of the Amazon, it's actually a huge river, one of the world's biggest in its own right. And Wallace was the first person to go up the Rio Negro, and using his skills in mapping that he had developed while he was a surveyor, he was the first person to actually draw an accurate map of the river. He also got into areas where nobody had ever collected plants and animals before. In the first 2 years of his trip, he managed to post specimens back to England, but his most interesting specimens from the Rio Negro, etc., he was forced to take on board with him when he went back to Britain after 4 years in Amazonia. Unfortunately, 26 days into the voyage, when they were literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the ship caught fire and they were forced to abandon to the lifeboats, and all of Wallace's collections of amazing specimens from the upper reaches of the Rio Negro, etc., were totally destroyed. Anyway, they floated around on lifeboats for 10 days. Wallace was in a terrible state, blistered from the sun, dehydrated, etc., and they were picked up by an old leaky vessel, and they actually ran out of food and water part way back to Britain, because basically they didn't have enough food on board for the extra people. Wallace was actually very lucky, because his agent Samuel Stevens, who had been selling his natural history specimens for him, had actually insured Wallace's collections, and that enabled him to live fairly comfortably in London. Because he wanted to continue his studies about evolution, etc., and also he needed to make a living, he decided to go off to what he called the Malay Archipelago, what is now Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia and East Timor. It was in the Malay Archipelago that Wallace made probably his two greatest discoveries. The first was what is now called the Wallace Line, an imaginary line dividing the faunas of the Oriental region, as it's called, to the west, and the Australasian region to the east. And Wallace was amazed when he crossed over from Bali to Lombok and suddenly realized that Lombok had a completely different bird fauna to Bali. You wouldn't expect it, that two adjacent islands would have totally different types of birds. He realized that this was a very significant observation, and this imaginary line was named Wallace's Line some years afterwards by Thomas Henry Huxley. Wallace continued to think about evolution and tried to get evidence and try an insight into how evolution actually worked. And he made his first breakthrough in 1855 when he was on the island of Borneo. In Wallace's Sarawak law paper, he proposed what he called a law that every species has come into existence coincident in space and time with the closely allied species. This suggested that evolution must have occurred. He sent off this paper hoping that people in Britain would be convinced that evolution was actually, a fact, and that Wallace's argument showed that, it should be taken seriously. Charles Lyell, who was one of the most famous scientists in Britain, had thought that his paper was very interesting indeed, and had actually mentioned it to Charles Darwin. He ended up going further and further east in the Malay Archipelago and used the small spice island of Ternate in Indonesia as his base. There's a big neighbouring island called Halmahera, and it was there in 1858, in February. Wallace was suffering probably from malaria and was lying in a small native hut in a village. And suddenly the idea of survival of the fittest occurred to him. He remembered reading years and years ago in Leicester an influential book by Malthus called Principles of Population. And Malthus said that the human population tends to grow exponentially over time, whereas the food supply grows much more slowly, and at some point where the two lines of the graph intersect, population growth will outstrip food production, and then there'll be a struggle for existence, and only the fittest basically would survive. So he came up with this idea applied to humans, and Wallace, while he was suffering in his malarial fit, suddenly realized that almost certainly the same thing had to happen with plants and animals and living things, and that populations tend to increase, food runs out, there'll be some individuals in the population that are fitter, bigger, stronger, whatever, and they'll be the ones who tend to survive and pass on their favourable characteristics to their offspring. And that's how evolution works. And this was, an amazing idea. He had been thinking about it for 10 years. Finally, he had the answer. When he got back to Ternate, he wrote a letter and an essay explaining his idea and put it in the post on the next mail ship to none other than Charles Darwin. In fact, Darwin had been thinking about it for 20 or more years and had come up with the idea of natural selection, about 20 years ago, but hadn't published anything because he was sort of gathering lots and lots of evidence.
Well, there's no doubt about it that he was faffing about. He had a lot of ideas, and he was working more detail, more ideas, and like any publishing scholar, adding more information to his broad body of thinking. And at the same time, Darwin, I think, his ideas across the 1850s were growing in really exciting ways. And Darwin was the kind of guy who was a conservative academic. He didn't want to cause a fuss. And the broad approach is to just absolutely 1000% overdetermine his argument. And then, of course, when Wallace's work shows up, Darwin is kicked up the backside, I think is the easiest way to say it, and is told in no uncertain terms, you've got to get on with this and get it done. And there's an absolute rush to get things published, and there's no doubt about it, the Wallace correspondence inspired Darwin, but there's an awful lot of activity beforehand.
And what happened next was that Charles Lyell and another of Darwin's friends called Hooker, who was a botanist, decided to present Darwin's ideas, unpublished ideas, which they knew about, on evolution by natural selection, together with Wallace's essay, to a meeting of the Linnean Society of London, all within about 14 days of Wallace's essay arriving in Britain. However, that was the first public announcement of evolution by natural selection, and a month later it was actually published in print by the Society. And what it did was send Darwin into basically a frenzy of trying to put together a book on the subject, and it was basically the famous book on the origin of species.
The initial reaction to The Origin is really very dull. You got to ask yourself, who is the audience for The Origin and who is the audience for evolutionary thinking? And this is where I think Wallace comes in very important ways, that Darwin is very happy to talk only to highly specialized scientists and carry out the technical conversation. The origin of species is an argument that takes place in public as well as amongst the professionals. And the public goes crazy over ideas about natural selection. No one cares about the evolution of sponges, and no one cares about the evolution of giraffes. What everybody in the popular world worried about was the origin of, well, us, humans. Where do humans come from? And Darwin was extremely quiet on that point, to the point of massive frustration. But lots of other people got into the argument, Wallace included. And Wallace played an important part of that conversation. He represented a very common view when it came to human evolution, that the animal world evolved in the way that it does, and the human body may have evolved the way it may have evolved from animals, but the human mind, the humanity, the things that make us special, that requires something more. And Wallace is a very interesting person to look at from that perspective, because he represents the majority opinion, and the conversation in the public about the reception to the origin of species and to the reception of evolutionary ideas, it's all about humans, and Wallace is right there in the middle of that conversation. So one of the legends in the thinking about the reception of the origin of species and evolutionary ideas is a so-called debate that takes place in Oxford in 1860 at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. On the one side is T.H. Huxley, Darwin's so-called bulldog, and on the other side is Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford. And it's remembered, it's retold as a story of science versus religion. But what it really seems to be is it's two fellas fighting it out in the playground, basically. Really what it boils down to is about human dignity. And if you think about if you think about evolution and you promote the evolutionary ideas, Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, thought that you dehumanized humanity. And he didn't like that, and he argued about it. They weren't really talking about the technical bits of evolutionary theory. What they were talking about was its implication for humanity. What happened at the time natural selection was proposed was the academic scientists debated it really hard. And they thought it worked, but only in a much more limited way than Darwin and Wallace did. And they both were really pushed hard to convince colleagues that what they saw in the world as a whole was actually going on. In the long term, natural selection was in for a rough ride across the 19th century, and it just didn't look like it was capable of causing the kind of evolutionary change, and lots of other processes were suggested to replace it. Natural selection gets a revival in the early 20th century, where with new thinking about genetics and Mendelism, it seems like, yes, you actually can get the amount of change in the amount of time you've got available. And then across the 20th century, all sorts of models and experiments and new natural history work is done, and it demonstrates quite conclusively that natural selection drives evolution. These days, natural selection is seen to be a powerful element in evolutionary theory. Lots of other things take place in evolution too. People haven't been asleep for 75, 100 years, just riding on the back of natural selection. But natural selection is an important element in the overall picture of modern evolutionary biology. It's really easy to relate the modern studies of genomics, like the Human Genome Project, back to thinking about natural selection, Darwin and Wallace. And the folks who study the human genome now find extraordinary diversity in the genome, not just in different communities or ethnic communities, but within single ethnic communities, massive diversity. And one question is, why is all that diversity there? If natural selection is so strong and powerful, why does it allow so much, not really junk, but why so much variety? How strong is natural selection? How powerful is it? How persistent is it? Those are questions that thrive in modern thinking about the Human Genome Project.
And when he got back to Britain, he was, quite a celebrity, especially as he was now associated with Darwin.
Well, we're standing in College Avenue at the moment, and although this is a much more modern road, behind us, of course, is the fantastic Dell, the house that was built by Alfred Russel Wallace. Well, Victorian Grays was expanding. Originally, of course, it was a very agricultural area, farming, but the centre of Grays had a nice high street and river frontage, which was really important for business. And then suddenly, in 1854, the London Tilbury Southend Railway arrived, and new openings for everybody. And slowly, after that date, you start to see settlement and new housing and new shopping developments increasing. And I think this was the focus that allowed Wallace to come and live here, but get to London quickly. Grays and Thurrock generally has had a long history of industrial production, and that's because of the natural geology of gravel and chalk and clay. So behind the Dell are extensive quarries, which have been excavated for the last 200 or 300 years. And ultimately, as Wallace was arriving in the 1870s, we know there were lime kilns, for instance, just behind the house. So it must have been a bit smoky and smelly, but that was just coming to an end because Portland cement had been invented in that same era, about the 1870s. And indeed, we know that Wallace buys cement, almost certainly from a local company, to build his house. What's also interesting is there's actually quite a big brick industry of Grays, which now, there's not much evidence of. Unless you look at the curtain walls to gardens, you'll see the clinker second bricks being used as walls. But Grays Park, for instance, is the bottom of a clay pit where brick earth was excavated, and millions of bricks were made, yellow stock bricks, which mainly was sold out of the district to London, which was the great purchasing power as London was developing. So a lot of those sort of industries are going on, modifying the landscape. And indeed, it's interesting that Wallace describes his little Welsh valley just behind the house which is partly natural ravine of the gravel terrace, but also I think modified through quarrying, and we know later on it was modified to make it into a romantic walk and garden areas down the slope. So fascinating landscape history as well as the history of the house itself. But by the time that Wallace arrived to build his new house, the cement industry had arrived in Thurrock, so we had a series of new cement companies digging out clay and chalk, converting it to cement. And Wallace, was one of those people with that scientific mind who thought, well, I can use this new material. And of course, although he employed an architect and everything, but it was one of the first concrete houses to be built. So I think it's quite interesting to see that juxtaposition of new industry, Wallace trying to get to London quickly, new house in a lovely setting on this escarpment that looks over Grays and over the River Thames. Looking this way down College Avenue, of course this was all open fields. Nowadays it's all housing and the convent. So I think there was actually quite a nice long view, maybe not as far as Tilbury, but I think once he stood in his garden, perhaps on the southern side of his garden, he'd certainly be able to see the River Thames by Grays, and I think looking towards Tilbury he'd see the estuary, the floodplains going out. It was interesting to know that Wallace had of course been travelling before he arrived in Grays, and indeed the time he was here he probably travelled around. But in the gardens of course there were some glass houses. He was obviously nurturing plants and carrying all those observations. So it's fascinating to think that one of his books was actually written here, and he would have sat in one of the rooms looking over the gardens and the glass houses where he was nurturing his plants, and actually finished his book, The Geographical Distribution of Animals, a very important world publication as it turns out to be. One of the drawbacks for Wallace was that he actually travelled to London quite often to meetings and to visit the various museums, and indeed he would visit the Geographical Society in London in Burlington Square, and he would go to the evening lectures. But unfortunately the evening lecture sort of ended by sort of 10:30, 11 o'clock, and he couldn't travel back to Fenchurch Street in time to get the last train back to Grays, and this seemed to rather peeve him, and maybe with other things going on he ultimately decided to move house from here, and so we lose sight of Wallace in Grays from that time onwards. The Dell, interestingly, was purchased almost immediately there's 2 or 3 owners we know. The managing director of the Victorian Wine Company was one. Then a local vet purchased it, Mr. Vincent, I think his name was, and indeed I've heard lots of stories about people bringing their animals to the side of the house where the veterinary had his little surgery. And then ultimately it was bought by the convent, and for the last few years the nuns from the convent, retired nuns and active nuns, lived in the nunnery, I suppose you'd call it, but it was the Dell.
And he spent the rest of his long life, he lived till 90 years old, promoting the idea of natural selection and working on a very wide range of other subjects. And he's also recognised as being the founder of the entire subject of evolutionary biogeography, and wrote 2 very important books on that subject, The Geographical Distribution of Animals and a book called Island Life. And it was basically the foundation of the study of how plants and animals are distributed around the earth and why they are found in certain areas and not in others, etc. He was buried in Broadstone, Dorset.
When you look at the whole history of Thurrock, it's a big area. There aren't that many people that you can say who lived here who had world influence. Yes, controversial, but world influence in the sense of his thoughts and his understanding about the science and observations he'd been making about natural selection. So I think he warrants probably the highest grade well, certainly the highest scientist who's ever lived here. Well, I think he'd be shocked by how many houses we have all around us, and the huge convent complex, and the Grays, which even in his day there weren't that many houses, and they were very much down nearer to the high street and running up the hill a little bit. Some houses were beginning to come along, but now everywhere seems to have housing. To the bottom of the hill, the Dell, all that along there is all housing. The College Avenue has been built, much later on, and this has got housing as well. So I think that would be a shock to him. I think he would have thought that he had lived in the countryside, and now it's an urban area. As part of our museum service in Thurrock, we adopted a scheme, the Blue Plaque scheme, of identifying properties and places where interesting events or interesting people lived. And one of the first that we ever put up in Thurrock under our own scheme, the Thurrock Heritage Plaque scheme, was to Wallace and put up on the Dell. You'll be able to see that if you ever come and visit the house. It's very prominent. And it's really interesting because we actually did have some relatives of Wallace come at the time, so it was lovely to have the family linkage, but also local people, local historians, which have from the local history society, who are fascinated about Thurrock's unique heritage, which many people in Thurrock just walk past and don't notice. So these green plaques are to just enhance that, and people think, perhaps I ought to know a little bit more and to go and read books or visit the society meetings.